We'll start this module by cleaning up the example code that we did in the previous module. Later, we will create a component to show a movie, both its image and a link to see the detail of the movie. Then we will make a movie list component, where we can watch several movies simultaneously. Later, we will use React hooks to simulate a delay when it comes to viewing the list of movies. This will help us create a more robust component. Then we will create a generic list component which will serve to encapsulate common operations that we want to perform when displaying a list of anything. Finally, we will install Bootstrap in our application. We are going to start by giving our application a little cleanup. In this video, we are going to clean up our project because in the previous module we did a lot of examples, but they were only for learning React and they were not related to the application that we're going to build in this course. So let me come here to the Explorer, src, and I want to delete basically every component but the app component and the index component. So I will select child, clock, conditionals, this CSS, display grade. We're going to leave the error boundary because that's useful. Events, expressions, grandparent, and let me continue. Map example, parent, project content, select number, simple, use effect, and the value context. That should be everything. So let me click on delete and I will move to recycle bin. And everything was deleted. Also, let me come to public index.html, and here we have this example. Let me delete this code from here because we are not going to need it. Let me close here, minimize this. Let's go to the app tsx and let's clean up this too. Let me delete everything from here. We're just going to leave the fragment. We're going to delete this also. And we're going to remove all of this and this and this and this. And let me say here h1 or h2. Hello world. We're going to see that in just a moment. Let me check the app CSS to see if we have anything here. We actually don't need this, so I can delete everything from here. And also the index CSS. Let me delete these two CSS rules from here. And that is fine. That should have taken care of everything. So let me say here npm start to run our application and see that everything is working. As you can see, we have some issues with the index.tsx. That's fine. Let's go back there. Let's come here. We don't have this. We don't have this or this. We can delete this fragment from here. And let's also put the app here. Let's remove this and everything should be fine. Let me save and let's see that if we come here and we refresh, we now have hello world. Excellent. Now we can start building our application. The application that we are going to build is related to a movie catalog. Therefore, what we are going to do is that we are going to create a component that will allow us to visualize a movie, specifically its poster and its title. So let's do that. Let's come back to Visual Studio Code. Let me close this and let me come to the Explorer, and in here I will create a new folder because in it we are going to put everything that's related to movies. Let me create a new folder and I'm going to call it movies and right click on that folder, new file, and I will say individual movie.tsx. We're going to create our component. We're going to say export default function individual movie, and we made a mistake. It should be individual with a capital I, so let me change that quickly, enter, and that's it. Now let's come back here and let's say return parentheses and let me put a div here. And now what are we going to do? we are going to have here an image and a paragraph, which is going to be the title of the movie. So first, what we're going to do is that we're going to define the parameter or props of this component, which is going to be a movie. So we're going to create a movie interface, but we're going to create it in another file because I want that interface to be accessible throughout my application. So let's come here, and in movies, let me right click here, new file, and I will say movies.model.d.ts. This D means that this is a type definition file, and we're going to use it for exclusively exporting interfaces. And let me press enter. And let me minimize this and say export interface movie DTO. DTO stands for data transfer object, and its purpose is to be data containers. So let me put here ID, number, which is the ID of the movie, title, which is the title of the movie, a string, and also poster, which is going to be the image of the movie, but in this case it will be a URL. So let me come back here and say props movie DTO, control dot to import movie DTO from movies model. I can come here and say anchor, image, ALT, poster, and then I can say src, expression, and let me close this, and I can say here props dot poster. Now what about the link? Well, in our case we're going to make a function here, build link, just to have this centralized, and I'm going to say, I actually don't need this curly bracket, I can say here movie slash props ID, which is the movie ID, and now let me come here and in the anchor say href expression build link. Now below this anchor we're going to have a paragraph which will contain the movie's title. So let me say here props title, and in this anchor we're going to use our build link function. Now I want to use some CSS, so I will use a CSS module for that. Let me come here, right click here, new file. I will say individual movie.module.css, enter, and I will say here div. Notice that I put a dot here because it will be a CSS class. I will say margin right 2%, margin bottom 10 pixels, and text align center. Then div paragraph height 44 pixels, font size 15 pixels, font weight bold. Then div image, we're going to work with the image with 225 pixels and height 300 pixels. And finally div a for the anchor, text decoration none. Okay, now let's use this CSS module here. Let me say import CSS from here individual movie.module.css. Now here I can copy this and put it here and say class name CSS div. Now this should be good to go, although I'm getting an error here because sometimes it cannot find a newly created file. So let's see if that gives us issues. In that case I should just close and open VS Code, but let me see this first. Let me come here in the app tsx file in the app component, and I want to say individual movie, and let me import this component from movies, individual movie, and let me pass here poster, title, and ID. So I need a movie here. Let me come here and say const test movie equal to, and let me make it of type movie DTO, and let me import that, and let's say ID 1, title equal to Spider-Man Far From Home, and finally poster. And we need a poster, so we're going to go to Google. Let me say Spider-Man Far From Home Wikipedia, and let's look for the Wikipedia page. Right click here, copy image address, and let's come back here and let me paste this here. And now let me pass our test movie. We can use test movie like this, and now we are passing the ID, title, and poster. And now let me save everything, and let's come back to Google Chrome. Let's come here, and as you can see, we have our movie here. And as you can see, the image is a link, and the title is also a link. So this is fine. We are progressing. Now what we're going to do is that we're going to create a component that will allow us to display a list of movies. Now that we have an individual movie on a screen, we can work with a list of movies. So let's go to Visual Studio Code and let's create a new component. Let's go here to the Explorer. In Movies, I will right click, New File, Movies List.tsx, and let's get to work. Let's say here export default function movies list props, and we're going to say movies list props, which is going to be an interface, return, and in here we're going to say div, and then let's come here and create the interface, which is going to be an array of movies. So movies, movie DTO, control dot to import that array. And now here we will use our map function of array to say props.movies.map movie, and we're going to say here individual movie, and we're going to pass to the individual movie the movie. So let's say here movie, and also we need to use the key, because remember that since we are creating a list of instances of this individual movie component, we need to help React to be able to differentiate between different instances, and that is why we have to use this key, which will serve as some sort of identifier. So here I will say movie.id. I use ID because every movie will have a unique ID, and therefore it is a great candidate for this task. Now I need to apply some CSS, so I am going to create a new CSS module for this file, for this component. So right click here, new file, movies list.module.css, and in here we're going to say .div display flex. We're going to use flexbox, flex wrap, flex direction, row, align items, center. Now let me save, and let's come back here and let me import that CSS module, CSS from movies list module.css, and let's come here and let me say class name css.div. Okay, now that we have this, we are ready to go. Let's go to the app component, and instead of using individual movie, I want to use my movies list. First, I want to say H3 in theaters, because we are going to have two lists of movies, in theaters and upcoming releases. Let's start with in theaters. So here we're going to have a movies list component, and let me import that. Let me paste that here, and we have movies list, and now I need an array of movies. So instead of test movie, I will have in theaters, which is going to be an array of movie DTO. So let me put here a square bracket and a square bracket here, so that now we have an array, and in here I will say movies equal to in theaters. Now of course it would be very boring to only have one movie, so let me put another one. I will clone this, comma here, paste ID 2, I will say here Luca, and now let's go to Google to look for Luca poster Pixar. This is fine. Let me go to here, right click here, copy image address. Let's go back here and let me paste this here. And now this is fine. But if we go to movies list, we can see that we have an error here. This should be individual movie with a capital I. Let me save. Now let me go to Google Chrome. And as you can see, we have in theaters, which are these two movies. And now we can repeat that for upcoming releases. So let's do that. Let's come back here to Visual Studio Code. Let me minimize this and come back here. And I will create another movie array. I will say here const upcoming releases movie DTO array equal to array, and I will just put here one movie. I will say ID 3, title Soul, and a poster. Let me look for a poster for that movie. Soul poster. Click on here, right click here, copy image address, and let me paste this here, and that is fine. Now let me pass this upcoming releases array to another instance of the movies list component, and that is done. Let me save and let's come back to Google Chrome, and in here you are going to see that now we have in theaters here and upcoming releases here. And this is what is so good about using components. Now as you can see, we can use our movies list component to display different lists of movies. We have in theaters here and upcoming releases here. And we can repeat that for as many lists of movies we want. Now, it is not realistic what we have here. If we refresh, you are going to see that our movies are immediately loaded. In the real life, we may be communicating with a web API as we will do in the future, and in that case, these movies would not be available immediately. We need to build our components so that they can handle that delay. Let's see how to do that. In the previous video, we were seeing that it is unrealistic that when we load our application, the movies are available immediately. In real life, we will be talking to a web API, which is the one that is going to give us the data of the movies. So I want to build my movies list component so that it can show a loading GIF before the movies are loaded. So let's do that. Let me come here to Visual Studio Code and let's see what we have to do. As you can see, what we have here is that I have this array which is immediately loaded, but I don't want to do that. What I want to do is to use a set timeout so that after, for example, 1 second, then we're going to have these movies being loaded. So let's do that. First, I want to create an interface that is going to contain these in theaters movies and these upcoming releases movies. I will do that because I want to have them together so that I manage them using the same state variable. And I talk about a state variable because we are going to be updating these variables, and then we will want the UI to be updated, which means that we want to re-render this component when we change the value of these variables, which means that we have to use a state. So let me come here and let's go to movies model, and in here I want to create a new interface which will be called landing page DTO, and this is going to have in theaters movie DTO array and also upcoming releases, also a movie DTO array. Also, I want to have them undefined because when we load our application, we will not have this information. So I want this array to be undefined because that is different than having an array with 0 elements. An array with 0 elements means that there are no movies to display, but if the array is undefined, then it means that we are still looking for the movies in the web API. So let me come back to the app component, and let me right click here and close others so that we don't have that many things open. Let me save. And now what I want to do is to use state. So I will say here const movies set movies equal to use state control dot to bring use state, and also I want to show you that you can put the data type here. So I want to say landing page DTO control dot to import landing page DTO, and I want to pass an empty object as the initial value of this movies state variable. Now we're going to use effect. So use effect, we have to use effect because we're going to use a set timeout, which we know has to be used with use effect. So let me say here const timer ID set timeout, and we're going to say here this anonymous function, comma 1000, which means that this function that we have here will be executed after 1 second. And then we say return here clear timeout timer ID. Here we are cleaning up the resources. So now let's come here, and in here is that we're going to say set movies, and we're going to pass in theaters, and here we're going to say equal to all of this that we have here. We can delete this equal sign and this semicolon from here, and then comma upcoming releases, and in here we're going to take this array that we have here, we're going to cut it. Let's go back up and let me paste it here, and now I can delete these two variables which we're not going to use anymore. And now as you can see, we have that these movies are being loaded after 1 second we load the component. So now let's come here, and instead of in theaters I want to say movies.intheaters and then movies.upcoming releases. Now we have an error. Why is that? Because the property movies of movies list is of type array of movie DTO, but in theaters is of type movie DTO array or undefined. So we need to take into account that in theaters could be undefined. So let's go to movies list and let's say here undefined, and now here we don't have any errors, but here we have one error. Of course, React is warning us that maybe this will be undefined, therefore there will be an error by trying to say map of undefined. So what can we do? Well, we can use a conditional. We can use a conditional in this way. We can say if props movies, and then we're going to say return. Here we can say, for example, loading, because if this array is undefined, then it means that our movies haven't loaded. Else if props movies dot length equal to 0, then if the array is of length 0, then it means that there are no movies to display. So I'm going to say there are no movies to display. Finally, we're going to say else, and this means that the movies array is loaded and it has elements. In this case, we want to say this. And as you can see, now we don't have any errors. And now our movies list component is also taking into account the fact that the movies array may be undefined or that it may have no elements. So now let me Ctrl+K+S to save everything, and let's come back here and let me refresh, and as you can see we have loading for one moment, and by accident I clicked on the link. So let me go back here and say this. For one moment we have loading on the screen. We can increase that time just to make sure that you are seeing it. So let me say here 4 seconds, save, here, refresh. So you have loading here for 4 seconds before the movies are being displayed, which is excellent. Now our component movies list is capable of handling the scenario in which the movies are undefined. And not only that, I can come here and make this a component. Remember that in React, everything that you want to reuse is a component. What if we want to have a loading component. We can do that. Let's come here. And instead of using movies, I will use, right click here, I will use a new folder. So folder, and I will say utils, which will be components that will be utilities. So right click here, new file, loading.tsx, enter, and let me export default function loading. And this will be a really simple component which will have a loading GIF. So let me go to Google Chrome. Let's go here, loading GIF. Let me look for a cool loading GIF like this one. This one should be fine. Control, right click here, copy image address, and let me say here img alt loading src, and let me put this here. And now I can use this component. I can come back here, and instead of having loading here, I can say, and let me delete this fragment, I can say loading. And now let me import that component. Let me say here loading from here, utils, loading. And now let me save everything, and let's come back here, and let me refresh. And now we have this beautiful loading GIF here, and after a few seconds the movies are going to appear. Now let me come back here, let me reduce this time to 1 because we don't want to be waiting 4 seconds every single time we open our page. Now this is fine, this that we have here is fine, but if you think about it, this is an action that we may want to do in several places. I mean, if you want to display a list of movie genres, you will want to show a loading GIF before the genres are loaded, show a there are no genres to display if there are no genres to display, and then do some action in the case that there are genres to display. So this logic that we have here could be placed in its own component. We will see that next. Let's create a generic list component that will handle this logic. So let's go here to the Explorer, and in utils we are going to create a new file which is going to be generic list component tsx, and now let's export default function, our new generic list component props generic list props, and in here return parentheses, and now let's get to work. Now here I will define the interface generic list props, and now let's see what we need. Let's come back here and let's see that we are using props movies in order to determine what we are going to show to the user. So I need a list parameter here, and now let me say here delete if props list, and in here I want to display something if the list hasn't been loaded, but I like to display a default UI if the parent component doesn't display something specific for this case. So we're going to create a parameter called loading UI, which will be optional, and it will be of type React element, control dot to import React element, and in here we're going to say if props loading UI. If loading UI is present, we're going to say props loading UI. Otherwise, we're going to say return, and we will use our loading GIF as the default UI that we're going to display in the case that the list hasn't been loaded. Then we're going to say else if here for the case in which the list has been loaded but it has 0 elements. So we're going to say props list length equal 0, and then we're going to repeat the exact same logic. We're going to create a new parameter here. We're going to call it empty list UI optional React element, and we're going to say here if props empty list UI return props empty list UI, otherwise return, and here we're going to return a fragment that will say there are no elements to display. Else we're going to return the default content of the generic list, which is going to be the list of elements. So for that, we're going to use children, which will be of type React element also. And here we're going to say return props children. Okay, let me save. Let's come back here. And now we can delete all of this. We will only leave that div. And let's say here, generic list component. And let me copy this, or should I say cut this and paste it here. And now first we need to import generic list. So I will copy this and paste it here and here. And then we need to pass a list. So list of movies. We should say props movies. And now here, because React doesn't know that this will only run when movies are present, we're going to say here question mark so that this code will not run if movies is undefined. So let me say Shift Alt F to organize this. And we're almost done. Now we only need to return this and we're good to go. Now let me save. Let's come back here. I will increase this to 4 seconds so that we have time to see the loading GIF. So let's come back here. Let me refresh. And you're going to see that we have the loading GIF. So this is indeed working. And not only that, I can come here and I can come here and let me say that I don't want to show the loading GIF, but that I want to have a custom loading UI. I can do that. I can say here fragment and say loading, for example. And let me save and let's come back here and let me refresh. And now we have loading here. So as you can see, we have centralized the operation of displaying the different states of our lists, whether the list is loading or the list is empty or the list has already been loaded. So let me go back here. Let me delete this because we don't really need it. And also let's come here. Let me put back here 1 second and let's continue working. In this video, we are going to install Bootstrap. With Bootstrap, we are going to have a CSS library that will allow us to have an easy time designing our application. So let me go to the terminal, new terminal, and in here I will say npm install Bootstrap at 5.0. We're going to use Bootstrap 5.0 for this course. So let me press enter, and that is going to install Bootstrap in our application. Bootstrap has been installed. Now we are ready to use it. First, I need to go to the index.tsx file, and in here I want to import Bootstrap's CSS. For that, I will say import node modules bootstrap dist css bootstrap css, and in this way we have the CSS of Bootstrap in our application. Now I can use it. For example, let's go to the app component. Let me go here first to Google Chrome, and as you can see, we have our images being too close to the edge of our screen. I don't want that, so in Bootstrap what we can do is to use a class called container. So here I will say div, and I will use a class name of container, Control S, and let's go back here and let me refresh. And as you can see, now we have some margin. So as you can see, we indeed have Bootstrap installed in our application. We can, for example, create a button with Bootstrap styling. So let me say here button, just as an example, of course, my button, and in here I will say class name bottom primary, Control S to save. Let's come back here, and as you can see, we have this bottom with Bootstrap styling. Now I want to show you something. We have this button that has Bootstrap styling, right? But if we're going to use Bootstrap throughout our whole application, shouldn't we have our buttons as a component so that we can have this centralized? Well, the answer is yes, that will be a good idea. So let's do that. Let me cut this from here and let me create a new component in utils, new file, button with capital B, tsx, and let me export default function button props button props return, and I will return a button, which is the button that we have in the clipboard. Let me cut this from here and put it right after the return, and let me define this interface button props, and now I will say children react.react node, and in here we are going to put that children. We're going to say here props children, and now we can save here and come back here, and for example, again, let me put button here, but this time it's going to be button with capital B. So let me import, and let me delete this. Let me import that button from, let me say, Uriel's button, and let's come down below, and let me say here the children, so whatever text, and let me save, and let's come back to Google Chrome, and now we have the button again with whatever text, but this time the design of the button is centralized in this component, which is great because now throughout the application we are going to be able to use this button component that we have here, and if sometime in the future I want to change the design of buttons, I only have to come here, change the design. Let me say that I don't want to use Bootstrap anymore. I can just change the design, and every single button in my application will be automatically updated, which is a great way of programming because now everything is centralized, so that if you need to change your whole application, you only need to change one place. So let me put this back as it was. Let me delete this button from here because we don't really need it. We were just making an example, and everything should be fine, though we have an alert here. We have this button here. Let me just delete it from here, and we don't have any errors nor any warnings, so we are good to go. On to the next module, in which we will talk about routing. See you there. In this module, we applied what we have learned to create a generic list that allows us to display a list of movies. This component allows us to show a loading GIF if the list has not loaded, and then the list after loading it. We installed Bootstrap in our application to have a framework for the visual part of our website.